Sanbonani Dumelang Absheni A Rearocha Morweni Lochani Huedak Jambo Mulishani Boatode Salam Alaikum Bonjo, and of course hello and welcome to this edition of Africa This Week, your wrap of what happened across the continent. I'm Mashudu Masuta. For our Africa Day coverage this week, we looked at enterprise development. For an analysis of developments and trends in the African market, we were joined by Kizito Okochukwe, Head of Research and Editor of the African Entrepreneur magazine.
The annual commemoration of the 1963 formation of the Organization of African Union, which was recently during the 2000s, was now brought to was now reformed or so, or rebranded to be African Union. So brilliant and great to see all the leaders coming together to forge a way forward towards making Africa a great place.
Okay, so where are we in the growth story of Africa right now? How would you evaluate it? Because of course you write for the Africa Entrepreneur magazine and you closely watch dynamics that are changing. It seems there's a lot of excitement. Africa is growing at a pace that we haven't seen it for some time now, and outpacing, of course, growth in the developed markets. So where do we stand in the growth story of Africa?
Where are we? Very interesting question. For the past decade, actually, it will be interesting to know that Africa average, or maybe let me say sub-Saharan Africa, has been growing average of 5.6%. So where are we today? I think we're making efforts. We're making a great effort in terms of development, in terms of poverty alleviation, and so on. But I think there is still a lot that still needs to be done, especially in terms of addressing these issues, in terms of corruption, in terms of unemployment in Africa, and so on.
So do we have a paradox here in that we've got strong growth, and we've had strong growth for some years? We in South Africa look with envy to many countries in Africa where they're having 6% growth. But you're saying the benefits, the supposed benefits, are not coming through.
Yeah. Actually, I don't think South Africa needs to look with envy or so on, because actually South Africa and Nigeria is still the biggest economy in Africa, you know.
Including Angola there.
Oh yeah. There is actually the big five. I call them the big five. In terms of investment opportunities, I call them the giants, which is Ghana, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and then South Africa. But they are not the big five. Those are just the investment opportunity areas to be. But the big five, you talk of Angola, like you said, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and so on. But one thing I want to say is South Africa need not to look with envy. South Africa is still a big place to invest. With 50 million people, it got $524 billion purchasing power. Together with Nigeria, also 300 and something billion purchasing power. So I think the two great economies, Nigeria and South Africa, needs to just come together and say, what is the way forward? How can we help to make Africa great, you know?
As part of our coverage on Africa Day, we also took a look at measures to lay a foundation for further African investment. We spoke to David Bridgman, manager of the Africa Investment Climate Team for the World Bank Group.
Well, we're at a very interesting time in Africa's history. We've had the first time now that Africa is actually growing significantly faster than the average global economy. We're looking more like an emerging market front runner than we are looking like an advanced economy. And this is a new state of affairs for Africa. We're familiar with seeing Africa lagging behind the normal average growth statistics. The second important thing is that certainly over the last decade, the amount of absolute poverty has dropped from 58% of the population to about 47% of the population. So over the last 10 years, we've seen a very significant decline in the number of people living in total absolute poverty. That's below about $1.25 a day. Now, these two are very important changes, and the question we're all grappling with at the moment is, so why is this? Is this just a result of the commodity price picking up, price of oil picking up, and maybe China's involvement in Africa, or is there something more fundamental going on here?
Yeah, so let's answer that question. Are we looking at a case where African countries and, you know, we've had change in governments across the board, they're making reforms right now that are really starting to bear fruit and create a lot more of an attractive environment for investors?
I believe this is I believe this is the case. There certainly has been, the involvement of China and the growth in commodities has been very important to Africa. It's put a bit of oxygen into the system. But for the body to really do well, you need to have hearts, lungs and gallbladders and all sorts of other things working, and that's what I think we've got right this time. If you look over the last 10 years at the fundamental changes, if you're wanting to create a good investment climate, there are really four main things you need to focus on. You need to focus on getting stability. You need to bring the wars to an end. You need to bring the coups to an end. You need to create a foundation of stability in a society. We've done that.
Yep.
By and large, huge progress in that over the last 10 years. Second area important is macroeconomic stability. Trying to get inflation down, trying to get governments to live on about the amount of money they get in and keep the inflation rate under control so that people can take decisions based on real indicators. That's been achieved. The third area which we're focusing on now, which people are focusing on, is the microeconomic reforms you need to get more businesses to exist, to get people to invest in infrastructure, because we need a lot more infrastructure than the government's ever going to be able to provide in Africa to fuel the fast growth we're getting, and of course to bring in more finance to fuel the businesses being started. So these are the areas where the work's being done at the moment, on all the microeconomic changes on an industry by industry basis, which help people to set up a business, to get going, to get access to finance, to get access to capital, and to be able to produce their goods and services on a platform of infrastructure which is produced. And this has been the exciting thing which has started happening over the last decade.
David, as I said, you've been doing this for 15 years now, looking at trying to implement some of these micro reforms. Give us your views on which countries have been really shining lights in terms of implementing reforms and being great success stories.
Well, probably the most famous one at the moment has been Rwanda, which really, in a determined effort to put its violent conflict of 1994 behind it, has focused on rebuilding its economy. They've made huge changes in their economy over the last decade, and they've been determined to improve. We bring out an annual ranking which we call Doing Business, which is basically how easy is it to do business in an economy. And Rwanda has been the second greatest improver in the world. Rwanda and Georgia have been the two great improvements in the world. Rwanda went up from something like, off the top of my head, 167 in the ranking up to about 47 in the ranking over a 3-year period. And this is basically because they introduced a number of laws which made it easier for people to start a business, made it easier for people to lend to businesses, so that financiers were prepared to put money forward to finance businesses, and they've been able to make some of the key infrastructure investments which need to be made. And so that's an example, but that's one of many. What's interesting is a number of the formerly conflict-affected countries have done very well. Liberia really turning itself around, Sierra Leone turning itself around, South Sudan's done very nicely. Closer to home, Zambia is doing very nicely at the moment. Mozambique's been stellar, coming from a very poor position to a somewhat better position. So we're seeing constant reform among a number of countries. Of course, this is what's important. You don't want someone who's a one-year wonder. You want people who are determinedly improving their environment for business and changing the rules so it's easier to invest in the country, including in infrastructure and to bring in finance. And this is a signal to investors that this is a government which is determined to make progress.
Kenya has Vision 2030, Nigeria Vision 2020. Now South Africa's economic engine, the province of Gauteng, has launched its own Vision 2055. Maruping Mokgokong prepared this report and began by asking Premier Nomvula Mokonyane to explain the vision.
Vision 2055 seeks to bring the ideas, the dreams, the aspirations of all residents of Gauteng, including the entire country, together as to what kind of Gauteng do we want to see by 2055. As we build, as continue to build now, what exactly do we want to have in terms of the kind of nation we want to belong to, the kind of infrastructure we need, the kind of values we aspire for, the kind of economy we want for Gauteng, and most importantly, how do we contribute to a prosperous South Africa as Gauteng.
The Premier was keen to emphasize why she considered the public crucial to a shared vision for the province.
No government can actually determine the future without its constituencies. And we felt that in as much as we have the Gauteng Advisory Council and the various institutions of higher learning and so forth, and various experts, it will not actually be correct for us to think long-term without those that we are planning for. And it is on those bases that we've learned from how the Freedom Charter as a plan was actually developed, that it is good that you go to individuals, you go to organizations, you go to opinion makers, you give everybody a platform, and to make sure that every contribution is made into one message that everybody can say, this is where we are all going to. We'll also be using different other platforms such as the Gauteng legislature, because part of what we don't want is to have a political process. We want it to be multi-party. It must include the views of every other political party that has a footprint in this province, and hence we'll use the Gauteng legislature, because that's a platform of who the political representatives of the people of Gauteng are. And then would also be going out and interact with our local authorities, with central government, even with our neighboring provinces on this city region and the dream about the future of the province.
Premier Nokonyane was hard-pressed to define what goes into creating a realizable vision.
Part of what we have already started to do is to bring different individuals who constitute the Gauteng Advisory Council that advises the Premier under the Planning Commission. And they are actually using different means of research, their own experience, their knowledge, the different sectors that are there, and would also be using the media, will be going to community-based organizations, would be using various means, will be reaching out to our youth, who are quite important because this is about their future and the time when they will be leaders of this province, that they must then say, what kind of a province do I want to lead? But we must start now. They must say, what kind of province do I want to live in? Because we're not going to wait for the plan to be concluded and say, we will see by 2055. It has building blocks of things that we must start working on, like road infrastructure, transport, safety and security, access to shelter, equal economic opportunities, and so on and so forth, but also building a South African nation. Because part of what we have learned over the past 18 years is that it is okay to invest, and government has invested a lot on infrastructure, on building houses, building schools, and all those kind of things. We must also invest on building a South African nation.
After the break, more stories making headlines this week.